They cut off her legs and left her for dead in the red dust. No farewell, no turning back. Her body was broken, her breath fading, until a man, one who had nothing left to hold on to, knelt down and lifted her from the heat. This isn't a love story the way you've heard it told. This is about two people who had already been buried by life and found each other anyway, in the dirt, in the silence, and in the scars no one else ever saw. If stories like this speak to you, take a second to follow the channel and leave a like. It helps me keep these forgotten Western stories alive one day at a time. Spring 1881. Arizona Territory. The land around Copper Ridge was cracked and bone dry. The sun didn't warm it punished, and the wind didn't sing, it scraped, carrying only grit and the memories of things lost long ago. At the edge of a ravine, half hidden beneath brush and stone, a body lay still. That body was hers, Saka, once a proud Apache warrior, fierce and respected. She had ridden into battle with her back straight and her eyes sharp. But now both her legs were gone, cut clean, wrapped in rawhide and silence. She had been left behind not out of cruelty, but desperation. There was no time, no way to carry her, no more words left to say. And so she waited. For death, for the sun to do what the blast hadn't, for the ants and birds to finish what the war had started. But then, on the third day, a stranger appeared. What happens next isn't just survival, it's rebirth. You'll witness a bond forged not by comfort, but by fire. A man who thought he was done with the world. A woman who was told her life was over. And together they'll prove that sometimes what's broken isn't lost, only waiting to be loved. Saka didn't remember the blast. Only the sound, like the world itself, had cracked wide open. Then came the weightlessness, and then fire. Pain unlike anything she'd known, searing through flesh and bone, ripping her legs into pulp. Her brother Tana was the last face she saw. His hands shaking, his eyes red, jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might break. He didn't speak, only held a blade to the fire, pressed it to her skin, and cut what was left. Not for cruelty, for mercy. The soldiers were closing in, the others were running, and Saka was too broken to follow. He wrapped the wounds as best he could, placed a half skin of water beside her, and kissed her forehead. Then he turned and disappeared into the rocks. She never heard him scream. She wished she had. At least it would have meant he turned around. The first day she tried to crawl. Her hands sank into the dust, pulling her forward inch by inch. But every tug felt like fire eating her from the inside. The blood wouldn't stop. She passed out before sunset. The second day the fever came. She woke to ants crawling across her belly, her chest even into her mouth. She couldn't lift her arm enough to swat them away. Her lips cracked, her throat burned. There was no shade, no prayers. Only the sun, the silence, and the steady smell of blood. By the third day, she stopped trying to move. The pain had settled into something quieter, deeper. She stared at the sky, her eyes barely open, watching hawks circle above like they knew her time was close. Some part of her hoped they'd come down. It would be faster than dying slow. But Saka didn't cry, didn't scream. Warriors don't scream, even when the world forgets them. Because right here at her lowest is where something incredible begins. Not from strength, not from hope, but from something deeper, the raw, silent will to keep breathing when everything else says stop. She was alone. She had nothing. And yet, she was still here. And that mattered. The truth no one says about dying like that, slow and forgotten, is how lonely it feels. Not just the kind of lonely you feel in your chest, the kind that wraps around your whole body like a second skin. Saka had always thought death would come with honor. A blade in hand, a cry to the spirits. But they're broken in the dirt chest, exposed to the heat, skin blistering and bones soaked with blood. There was no honor, no dignity, only survival and silence. And yet deep inside her, something still refused to let go. Maybe it was the memory of her brother's tears. Maybe it was spite or pride. Or maybe it was something even smaller. The idea, foolish as it was, that someone might come, not to rescue her, but to see her, to say, "You are still here," and that means something. In that moment when her skin was baked raw and her breath came shallow, she became something else. Not a warrior, not a woman, but a spark in the dirt. Waiting. Before we continue, if you're still watching this story, I want to ask something simple. Where are you tuning in from? Drop your city or state in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you believe in stories that hold truth, heart, and second chances, go ahead and follow this channel. There's more coming, and I'd love to share it with you. Wade Holt wasn't the kind of man folks remembered easily. He didn't drink at the saloon, didn't sit on church pews or wave from horseback. In Copper Ridge, they called him Quiet Wade, the sort of quiet that people didn't ask questions about. Not angry, not mean, just gone behind the eyes. But silence wasn't madness. It was armor. 3 winters ago, a fire took everything. A wind-blown ember, a tilted stove, and a half-hour too long along, out fixing a fence. By the time he smelled smoke, it was already too late. The roof caved in before he could get past the door. Inside were the only 2 people who'd ever made the place home, his wife Lila and their daughter Mara. She was 2. Barefoot. Loved frogs. Never caught one. Wade buried them in the north field under a crooked cottonwood. He carved the names himself with a dull blade. Then he stopped talking. Stopped praying. Stopped living, really. Just moved. He kept the ranch going because a man needs something to do with his hands. Tending fences, watering horses, checking cattle. But he didn't build anything new. Didn't ride into town. Didn't open the trunk by the bed where Lila's shawl still smelled like lavender. Every day was the same, and he liked it that way. Predictable. Quiet. Until the day he followed a stray heifer out past the gulch and found a woman bleeding into the dirt. Her body looked wrong, bent and blistered, part of her dress torn, and burned her thighs wrapped in makeshift bindings soaked through with blood and dust. At first he thought she was dead, but then her chest rose. Barely. Apache. That was clear enough. The beadwork, the cut of her clothes, the bone-tied necklace around her throat. He hadn't seen one this close since the war, but he recognized the markings. She didn't speak. Her lips were split, her eyelids half shut, the skin of her arms cracked like old leather. She didn't look scared, just watching him, like she was already used to being left behind. He could have walked away. Should have. A dying Apache woman on his land. That was trouble if anyone ever came asking. And what could he do for her anyway? She was half dead, legs gone, fever probably already eating her alive. But then he looked into her eyes. There was no begging there, no pleading or panic. Just the quiet, waiting kind of pain, the kind he'd seen once in the mirror 3 years back, with smoke still in his hair and ash on his hands. And something inside him shifted. Not pity, not duty, recognition. She'd been left behind by the people who loved her. So had he. So Wade took off his hat, stepped forward, and bent down. Slid his arms beneath her back and behind the places her knees should have been. Her body flinched, breath caught in her throat, but she didn't cry out. She just watched him, as if wondering if this would be the time someone saved her or left her again. He didn't say a word. He lifted her gently, turned back to his horse, and carried her home. The cabin wasn't much. One room, split pine walls, a stove in the corner, and a cot by the window. He laid her down like he remembered laying down his daughter when she'd fallen asleep on the porch swing. Then he went to work. He boiled cloth, tore old sheets into bandages, cleaned the wounds with pine sap and water. The stumps were raw, angry things, the edges split and dark. He didn't flinch, just cleaned, wrapped, steadied his hands when they started to shake. She didn't speak, he didn't either. By the time the sun went down, the wind had picked up. It rattled the shutters and whispered beneath the door. She slept or passed out. Hard to tell. Wade sat by the table, arms folded across his chest, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of her breath. For the first time in 3 years, someone else was in his home. And for the first time since the fire, he felt like a man with something left to lose. Sometimes the hardest part isn't saving someone. It's deciding you're still the kind of person who would. And maybe, just maybe, that choice is what saves you too. If this story speaks to something in you, if you've ever carried grief in silence or wondered if healing was still possible, stick around. There's more to come. And if you haven't already, go ahead and follow this channel. We tell stories that remember what matters. She didn't wake until the second morning. Her breath was slow, but even her face pale beneath the dirt and dried blood. Wade had already changed the dressings twice. He'd boiled cloth, packed the wounds with pine sap, and sat at her side through the night without saying a word. He hadn't expected her to last this long, but she had. And something about that mattered more than he wanted to admit. When her eyes finally blinked open, they didn't flutter or panic. They just looked. She scanned the room, quiet and slow, like a wild animal, still deciding if it was safe to breathe. Her gaze landed on him where he sat in the chair by the wall, arms folded, boots dusty from the morning's chores. "You live here," she said, voice rough, every word cracked open like sun-baked stone. He nodded once. "You could have left me." "I didn't." It wasn't apology. It wasn't explanation. It was just truth. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. Gratitude was too small a word for what had just passed between them. Instead, silence filled the space again. But this time it wasn't hollow. It had weight, like something old and unspoken had started to stir between them. Later that day, when he returned from the barn with an armful of firewood, he found her trying to sit up. Her arms shook from the effort, her jaw clenched tight as she pulled against the edge of the cot blanket, slipping away to reveal raw stumps wrapped in fresh bandages. She winced, slid, caught herself. Wade dropped the wood without a word and crouched beside her. He slipped a hand behind her back, the other beneath what remained of her thigh, and lifted just enough to help her upright. She didn't pull away, didn't speak. But when she exhaled, it was slow, almost steady. That night, he couldn't sleep. The cabin was quiet. She was breathing easier. But he sat by the stove, staring into the dying fire, fingers twitching like they used to in the war, when he knew something had changed, but didn't yet know what. Around midnight, he stood, grabbed a lantern, and went into the barn. He didn't know what he was building, only that it had to be done. He tore apart a broken cart and an old chair, cut wood until his hands ached, used thick cloth and rope to shape a padded seat wide enough to balance her hips, low enough for her to push with her arms. He tested it by pressing down with his full weight, listening for creaks or cracks. None came. By the time the sun rose, his shirt was soaked through and the skin on his palms was raw. But the thing stood. Solid. It wasn't pretty, but it was freedom. He carried it into the cabin like a man bringing in a gift too fragile to explain. She was already awake, propped against the wall, her hands curled in her lap. When she saw it, she didn't speak at first, just stared. Then, quiet as wind through dry grass, she said, "You made this." He nodded, set it beside the cot. "I don't beg," she added, eyes locked on his. "You didn't," he replied. Her fingers touched the wood, like it might vanish if she pressed too hard. No smile, no tears. But something different flickered behind her eyes, like a part of her had just remembered she was still alive. Wade lifted her gently and helped her into the seat. She gritted her teeth as the motion stretched tender muscles, but she didn't cry out. Her hands gripped the railings, and for the first time since the ravine, she moved forward on her own. It wasn't far, just a few feet, but to her it must have felt like crossing a mountain. He didn't speak. She didn't need him to. Sometimes the biggest change in a person's life doesn't come from a miracle or a war. It comes from a quiet moment when someone chooses to lift you from the dirt, and means it. He didn't owe her anything. She didn't ask for help. But in that small, silent space between death and survival, a bond had been forged. One neither of them had planned for. One neither of them would forget. Sometimes it only takes one decision. One hand reaching down when the rest of the world walks away. Wade didn't think he was that kind of man anymore. But when he lifted her from the dust, he saved more than her body. He reclaimed something in himself, too. She moved only a few feet that first day. The wheels scraped lightly across the cabin floor, her arms trembling as she pushed herself forward inch by inch. The muscles in her back screamed from disuse, and by the time she reached the stove, her breath came in shallow bursts. She stopped there, hand resting against the wood, sweat trailing down the side of her neck, and stayed still for a long while, just breathing, just being upright. Wade didn't say anything. He was chopping onions near the table, the knife moving in steady rhythm. He didn't offer help, didn't ask if she needed it. And somehow that made it easier. Because she wasn't his project. She wasn't a wounded animal. She was still a warrior, even if the world had stripped away her weapon, her legs, her tribe. He saw her. That was enough. The next day she tried again, and the day after. Her palms began to blister, then bleed. She wrapped them with old cloth and kept going. Each time she moved a little farther toward the water barrel, then the table, then the front door. Sometimes she cursed under her breath in Apache. Sometimes she groaned and bit her lip until it bled. But she never asked for help. Not once. And Wade never offered. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew what it meant to her to do it alone. By the end of the week, she could sit herself upright without assistance. She'd brace one hand against the cot, swing her torso forward with a sharp breath, and land in her rolling seat with a grunt. Then she'd adjust the belt at her waist, tighten the tie around her shirt. His shirt now, and push off toward whatever she'd set her mind on. The shirt was too big, sleeves rolled twice at the wrists, but she wore it like armor. He'd left it folded at the foot of her cot one morning without a word. She hadn't said thank you, but she wore it the very next day. There were moments, quiet ones, when he'd glance over and find her watching him, not in suspicion, not even curiosity, just watching like she was studying the shape of a man who never asked anything of her. And every so often, he caught himself watching her too. The curve of her shoulders as she lifted the kettle, the grit in her face when she missed a turn and had to back herself up, slowly cursing softly under her breath. He never smiled, but something warmed in his chest when she succeeded, and that was a kind of smile all its own. One evening she tried to cook. He'd gone out to fix a loose board on the barn wall, and when he returned, the cabin smelled of charred beans and singed wood. She'd dropped the pan, cursed the flames, and nearly knocked over the stool trying to clean up the mess. He didn't say a word, just bent down, picked up what could be salvaged, and scraped the rest into a bucket for the chickens. She sat in the corner, arms folded, pride bruised, but not broken. The next day she tried again, and this time the beans were edible. They didn't talk much, not in the way other folks did. But things passed between them anyway. Looks, small nods, the shared weight of silence that had turned from something heavy into something earned. After supper one night, he pulled another chair to the table. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't object. They ate side by side, the lantern between them casting gold across the table. She chewed slow, careful, her eyes flicking toward him once or twice. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and even. "You always this quiet," he looked at her, shrugged. "Talk when I need to." She smirked. "Guess I talk enough for both of us." His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. She saw it, though, and that was enough. By the end of the second week, she could push the door open on her own. The first time she did, she paused in the doorway, staring out at the light, like it might burn her. The wind touched her face dry and sharp. She closed her eyes and let it sweep across her skin. He was standing in the yard mending a fence post, but when he turned and saw her there, upright, steady, alive, he didn't wave, didn't call out. He just tipped his hat once, slow and quiet. She nodded back. No words passed between them. But that was the day she stopped dying. She hadn't walked, hadn't run, hadn't held a weapon or climbed a ridge, but she had opened the door, and that meant more than anyone else would ever know. She didn't flinch anymore when he touched her. That realization came one morning, simple and quiet, like most truths worth keeping. He was helping her adjust the blanket that had slipped from her lap. His hand brushed against her hip, bare where the shirt hung loose, and she didn't pull away, didn't tense, just glanced up at him with the calm of someone who had chosen to stay. He noticed it too, the way her shoulders didn't stiffen, the way her breath didn't catch like it used to. She trusted him now, not in a loud-spoken way, but in the way her body relaxed when he stepped near, in the way her eyes met his without flinching, and something inside him stirred slow and warm, like an old fire reigniting from forgotten embers. She started leaving the shirt unbuttoned at the top. Not much. Just enough for her collarbone to show the edge of a scar visible where skin met shadow. He never stared, but she knew he saw. That was the point. She didn't want to be invisible anymore. That evening she asked to sit outside. He lifted her gently, wrapped her in the woven blanket she'd stitched herself, and carried her to the bench on the porch. The sun was settling low, bleeding orange and gold across the sky, and the breeze carried the soft scent of mesquite and old grass. They sat together in silence the way they always did, shoulder to shoulder. Her head leaned slightly toward him, not touching, but close enough that if one of them moved, it wouldn't be an accident. After a while, she turned to him. Her voice was soft, steady. "You ever touched a woman just to feel her breath?" He looked at her, not startled, just still. "Not out of duty," she added, "not out of pity. Just touch. Because you want to." The pause between them wasn't heavy. It was full. "I'm not broken," she said. "Don't look at me like I'm a ghost." "I don't," he answered. She reached out, then slow and deliberate, and placed his hand on her waist. Not on what was missing, but on what remained. Her skin was warm beneath his fingers, scarred, strong, real. His hand trembled just a little, but he didn't pull back. Her lips brushed his cheek, then lower, slow, sure, without demand. When their mouths met, it wasn't hungry. It was honest. It was a question neither of them had asked in years, and an answer they both already knew. When he carried her back inside, the lamp was low, and the wind whispered against the window panes. She didn't cover herself when he laid her on the cot. She let the shirt fall open, let him see the curve of her chest, the jagged trail of a healed wound across her thigh, the hollow where muscle used to be. He didn't look away. He undressed in silence, slow, careful. His own body bore stories too, an old bullet scar near the hip, a burn mark along his ribs, the lean angles of a man who'd lived more years in grief than in peace. She reached out, ran her fingers along the scar, and whispered, "You ain't the only one with ghosts." That night they didn't rush. They didn't chase need or escape memory. They moved like people learning each other's weight, each other's breath. He kissed the inside of her wrist. She held his face in both hands. When he moved over her, it wasn't fire, it was steady warmth, low and lasting. And when it was done, he didn't roll away. He stayed. Let her rest her head against his chest. Let her fingers settle just above his heart. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to prove. Sometimes the deepest healing doesn't come from being saved. It comes from being wanted exactly as you are. You're still here, and that means something. Maybe this story has found you for a reason. Maybe it's not just about them. Maybe it's about what's still possible after grief, after silence, after scars. If that's true, stay with us. There's more ahead. The morning after they first lay together, the world outside didn't look any different. The sky still stretched wide and pale above the hills, the wind still carried dust across the porch, and the chickens scratched at the yard like they always did. But something between them had shifted, quiet but certain. He poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her without speaking. She took it, fingers brushing his. Her legs, or what remained, were covered by the woven blanket she kept near always now. She wore his shirt still cinched tight, with a length of hide sleeves rolled neatly to her forearms. The look in her eyes was different, calmer, present, as if for the first time in a long while she wasn't waiting to vanish. He sat across from her and sipped his coffee in silence. She tore a piece of bread and passed him half without asking. These small things, the sharing, the gestures, the glances, were their own kind of language now. She watched him for a moment, then asked, "Why didn't you shoot me?" His brow lifted. "When you found me, in the ravine. I was Apache, half dead. You could have put a bullet in my head and saved yourself a lot of trouble." He looked toward the window, then back at hers. "I saw a person," he said, "not a side." She didn't answer right away. Then she whispered, "They left me. My brother Tana. He cut the legs, told me he'd come back. I think he believed it. But no one came." There was no accusation in her voice, just the flat ache of memory. He understood it, that quiet place between grief and anger where love still lingered like a wound that wouldn't close. He reached across the table and took her hand. She didn't pull away. That afternoon, he started building a ramp at the back porch. She watched from the doorway as he hammered thick boards into place, arms moving with the steady rhythm of a man who had made peace with hard labor. Sweat glinted at his temples, and dust rose around his boots. She didn't offer to help. She just sat there, a blanket over her lap, eyes narrowed, watching him like she was memorizing every motion. "You expect me to run laps around the yard?" she called out. He didn't look up. "I expect you'll want the choice." She smiled, but didn't answer. That night, after the sun had sunk behind the hills and the cabin was lit only by the soft hum of lamplight, she asked to go out again. He carried her to the bench, sat beside her, and they watched the stars without speaking. Her shoulder brushed his. Not accidental. The wind was mild. The land breathed quiet. But quiet doesn't last forever. Sometimes it's not the ghosts you've buried that find you. It's the ones that never stopped walking. 2 mornings later, just after first light, she wheeled herself out to the chicken coop while he repaired a section of the back gate. The breeze carried the smell of dry earth and sage. Everything was still until her voice broke through the air. "There's someone coming." He straightened slowly, wiped his hands, and followed her gaze to the east trail. A rider, just one, moving slow, the dust plume behind him low and lazy. The figure wore a long coat and a wide hat, his horse, or maybe it was a mule, trudging steady beneath him. Wade's hand moved instinctively to the rifle leaning against the barn wall. He didn't say a word. Just walked to the house, grabbed the weapon, and stepped back onto the porch. Saka was already off to the side, tucked just behind the corner wall. Her hand rested under the blanket across her lap, fingers curled around the handle of the knife Wade had given her days ago. Just in case. The rider dismounted, tied his reins to the post, and lifted a hand in a half-hearted wave. "Friendly?" she asked from behind the wall. "Don't smell like cavalry," Wade muttered. The man walked toward the fence line, boots coated in trail dust. "You Holt?" he called. Wade didn't answer. The man reached into his coat, slow, careful, and pulled out a folded paper. "Territorial Marshal's office sent me. Said there was movement east of the gulch last month. Cavalry stirred up something. They want names." Wade took the paper. It bore a seal. Looked real enough. The name read, J. Mallory Marshal. "You live out here alone?" the man asked, peering around. "Quiet suits me," Wade replied. The man glanced toward the coop. "Thought I saw something move out there." "Chickens get curious," Wade said, eyes flat. The man studied him, waiting for something that didn't come. After a beat, he tipped his hat. "If you see anything Apache sign uniforms riders, send word." Wade nodded once. Didn't offer more. The man mounted and rode off slow. When he was gone, Saka wheeled herself back into view. He saw something she said. Wade nodded. He didn't say it, but he saw. They didn't talk much after that. But the quiet wasn't peace anymore. It was waiting, watching, preparing. Because peace, once it's found, becomes something worth defending. If you've ever built something fragile in a world that wants to break it, if you've ever held your breath when the past came knocking, then you know what this moment means. Stay close, because what's coming next will test everything. The man hadn't even crossed the ridge when Wade started counting ammunition. He cleaned the rifle a second time, moved the lamp oil closer to the floor hatch, tightened every hinge in the house twice. He didn't speak, didn't explain. But Saka watched him with eyes that understood more than he said. That night, she didn't ask to sleep alone. She pulled herself into the cot beside him, settled against his chest, and listened to the wind hit the shutters. Her breath was calm, but her hand stayed curled around the knife beneath her pillow. In the morning, he found her carving something. Thin slivers of bone shaved smooth. Her fingers were steady now. Strong. She didn't look up when he stepped in, just said, "I'm making something. For us." He didn't ask what. 2 nights later, after supper, she handed it to him. A small ring, rough around the edges, carved from bone tied with a strand of rawhide. "You took me in when I was nothing but blood and dust," she said. "That's more than most men ever do for a wife." He stared at the ring in his palm, then slipped it on without hesitation. "Then I guess I'm her husband now." She smiled, real this time. "You always were." Some things don't need a priest or a paper. Just a fire, a promise, and the kind of silence that means you're home. Sometimes the fight isn't to survive, it's to protect what made surviving worth it. And for them, this cabin, this porch, this firelight between them, it had become a place worth dying for. They didn't mark the day it all changed. No anniversary, no ceremony, just a morning like any other when the sky turned soft with clouds and the land smelled faintly of wet dust. She wheeled herself onto the porch, the woven blanket draped across her lap, hair pulled back with a strip of hide. He joined her minutes later, coffee in one hand, the other resting lightly against the frame of the door. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The cattle grazed quietly in the distance. A hawk circled high overhead. The wind was light, not sharp like before, just enough to remind them they were still alive. He looked at her then. Really looked. The scars, the strength in her eyes, the bone ring at her throat carved from memory. She met his gaze calm and steady and reached for his hand. No fear there anymore. No shame. No need to run. And for the first time, Wade understood something he hadn't been able to name. It wasn't just that he'd saved her. She'd saved him too. Not with words or thanks, but by staying. There's a kind of love that doesn't come from flowers or promises. It comes from standing in the wreckage and choosing each other anyway. Still choosing. Still staying. Still here. If this story found something true in you, if it made you feel something quiet and heavy in your chest, don't let it be the last. Follow the channel for more stories like this one. Stories of ruin, of return, of what's left, when everything else falls away. Because sometimes what remains is exactly enough.